The story of the design of Emberheart, my new worker placement game co-designed with Rob Fisher by Mindclash Games, goes back over 10 years. And so I'm going to try and break down the design decisions that we made in creating this beautiful new game, which is coming out in October 2025 at Essenspiel. In fact, it's starting to get into the hands of people who had pre-ordered it already, so it should be available in game stores, I would imagine, very, very soon. It's such a long, detailed story, but I'm going to tell you about the design decisions that we made and how the different iterations happened and why it took 10 years, essentially, to get it to this point. Emberheart is a game where you've got humans and they're living alongside dragons in this peaceful sort of environment, and poachers have come in to this environment and they're stealing the dragons. So we have to send out parties of workers to rescue the dragons and to move them into peaceful sanctuary type spaces, preserves, and we use heroes with special abilities. We attach them to dragons in order to power up those abilities, and then we send out parties to fight off the poachers as we go. And there's a flame track in the game where your flame increases as you play, and you've got to monitor this because your town is burning, firstly because it's full of dragons, but also because we're fighting against these poachers throughout the game. So you have to manage that element as well. The game is illustrated by Andrew Bosley, who illustrated Everdell, which is my favourite game of all time currently. I love playing Everdell and I've always loved the artwork specifically. So as I've mentioned in previous videos, that was a hugely exciting part of Emberheart. But it goes back way back before any of this was a consideration, although the dragons were always there. And this basic premise of humans and dragons living together was always part of the story. So let's rewind right back to the beginning. I'm going to try and talk you through the design decisions that went into creating this game. So initially, talking back in maybe 2014, something like that, I would imagine, maybe 2015, Rob Fisher and I were basically co-running a local board game design group which would meet once a week, and we'd playtest each other's games and so on. And so far Rob and I hadn't collaborated on any games, although I was putting a lot of input into his games that were in development. He was putting a lot of input into mine. So Rob Fisher had a lot of input into games like Pikoko and Doodle Rush and Big Bazaar, my early games that came out in 2017, 2018, that sort of thing. Rob Fisher had a hand in those games as a playtester, though not as a co-designer. At a certain point along the way, we decided to kind of let's step up that design relationship and properly collaborate on some games. And at the time, Rob Fisher was designing a small game with dragons. And the basic premise remains in Emberheart. So this was Rob's, essentially his first basic premise of the game was a loop, okay, a sort of feedback loop. So let me try and describe that to you. Essentially, you were trying to collect dragons. So there was one location, one worker placement location where you would go in order to get dragons. Now, how do you get the dragons? You place workers at that location. So the next question then is, how do we get workers? Well, you have to go to a different location. So if we want to get workers, we've got to place money at this other location, which we called the city gate, or Rob called the city gate. So you would pay money at the city gate to get workers, and you would send your workers to the wilderness in order to get dragons. But where'd you get the money from? Well, you get the money by sending workers to do jobs around the dragons that you've collected. So you would send workers to do jobs with the dragons in order to get money that you would then spend to get workers to send out to get dragons. So you can see how this loop is starting to form. Now, if you didn't, collecting the dragons was dangerous, okay? Your workers were dice, and when you placed dice to get the dragons, when you resolved these locations, you would roll the dice to see if you were able to capture that dragon, or if not, your worker would die in the process, okay? Your worker would be killed by that dragon, and various dragons of different strengths were more dangerous than others. So lots of these dice were being removed, so you constantly needed to replenish your workers. Was there a safer way to get dragons? Well, yeah. Okay, you could buy them. You could buy them from the market. So if you go to the market, you pay money in this location, but you get low value dragons. They're worth far fewer points because you haven't gone out and captured them in the wild. You've gone to the market to purchase them. Why are we collecting these dragons? Because we want to build sets. So you could use your workers to go to a location where you present your sets of dragons in order to gain victory points. And then finally, to add a little bit of spice to this kind of feedback loop, Rob had a location where you could go to get these characters, these heroes or specialists, which had special abilities on them, which allowed you to break the rules in various different ways. And the bidding mechanism was very similar to what we've got in Emberheart, where you would place maybe 4 dice of your colour in a location. Somebody else might place 3 dice of a location in their colour. Somebody else might place 1 die of their colour. Well, the person who placed more die was going to get the first opportunity to roll those dice to try and capture those dragons, or who placed the most coins would get the first choice of dragons to purchase from the market, or would get the first pool of workers when they go to the city gate in order to gain their workers. So we had something very similar to the mechanism that we now have in Emberheart. There was an element that started to get introduced over time of shame. So we had a lot of worker placement games have a virtue track. Rob was very keen on having this as a very satirical sort of game, looking at capitalist society and exploitation and creating this sort of grotesque picture of society. Was in a sort of almost Monty Python or Blackadder or Terry Pratchett, this very British sensibility, really humorous approach, and the idea was that the artwork would show this sort of grotesque picture, almost this Orwellian sort of society. So we had this shame track, and the idea with the shame track was that certain actions would cause you shame. Okay, so obviously, like recklessly sending out your workers to perish, in order to gather these dragons, or sending out certain type of work. Maybe you collect, instead of gathering a nice bunch of nice healthy young workers, you'd get a bunch of elderly old workers who probably shouldn't be going out and fighting dragons, but you send them out anyway, and you take shame for doing so. And so the key thing with the shame track was that it wasn't good taking shame, right? You were going to lose points, but shame was only really relevant if it was in comparison to other players. So you could take lots of shame as long as everyone else was taking lots of shame. If you were the only one taking lots of shame and everybody else was being very virtuous, you were going to be punished in terms of points. Now, of course, that shame track has morphed over time many, many times in lots of different ways, but it's ended up being this flame track, which I love in Emberheart. This was a decision on the part of the publishers to make it flame, because what that does is it creates this atmosphere of a city, a town that's burning, right? We're constantly having to manage, right? If I'm doing this, if I'm wasting time at the tavern, then meanwhile, there's fires burning in my town, and I might get more workers by doing that, but my flame is increasing. If I'm going out into the wilderness and I'm catching the biggest dragons, it's dangerous. They're setting things on fire. Okay, so we're constantly managing that flame track in Emberheart. So one decision that I made very early on in the collaboration with Rob was, Rob had every player having their own colour of dice. And so your workers were your colour. So I might place out 4 red dice, the next player places out 3 blue dice, someone else places out 5 green dice, and that's fine, okay? But it meant that you needed to have loads of dice of every colour, like the number of possible workers that a player could have were quite big. So the component cost was going to be massive. So I realised fairly early on that wasn't going to be workable. We needed to have a single colour of dice, and how was that going to work? Well, when you place your bid, you could just put your dice onto a tray of your colour. So my 5 yellow dice, or whatever it is, that was the standard colour for everybody. My 5 yellow dice go on my blue tray and I place that out. Somebody else's pile of yellow dice go on their green tray and they place that out. So we're all using the same colour. It reduces the component pool. And actually those trays that we place out remain in Emberheart. Those are the little crests that we place on top of our workers to indicate that they're That's our party, our pool of workers. So we don't have individual workers for an individual colour of worker for each individual player. And that's where that concept comes from. It's funny sometimes thinking about something that seems so obvious, but where it goes back to, where it originated from, is something very different to what you'd expect, right? It was a very long, convoluted process of getting to the point where we're placing out a series of workers that everybody has the same, but we place a crest on top of it. So a lot of the bare bones of Emberheart were there at those early stages in those early playtests. Because we were rolling dice an awful lot, and this was... I can never remember which one's input randomness and which one's output randomness, but we're making decisions, then we're rolling dice to see if we were successful. That's rare in a strategy Euro game, okay? Generally, in a strategy Euro game, if you're using dice, you're rolling them, and then you're making decisions based on that roll about how you want to use that dice. That's not what we were doing here. You know, I decide I want to capture this size 5 dragon. I've got to roll a 5 on my die, otherwise my die is dead, okay? It's a dead die. My die dies. So my dice who die, they go into a graveyard. This was our way of mitigating that randomness. So dice would build up in this graveyard. And by now, Rob and I were working together on this, developing. Dice would be going into this graveyard. The more dice that you have in there, you start to get tokens which allow you to mitigate the randomness, giving you re-rolls, opportunities to flip dice and so on, add to dice, little tokens you could spend. So by sort of sacrificing these dice workers, your fate is kind of giving you these abilities that you can then go on and use. And of course, the heroes that we're gaining from what was called, I think, the Guild Hall would allow you to, again, mitigate that and all these different things, lots of ways to break the rules. So let's go through each of those sections point by point, and we'll look at how those things developed. So if we start off with the first section, which is the what was called the Guild Hall, but now is the Heroes Guild. When we're going there, we're getting special abilities, okay, and that's always been the case. But what we started to notice very early on was that when you're taking special abilities from there, of course, they're only really relevant in the first few rounds of the game. You don't want a special ability in the final round of the game because you're hardly going to get an opportunity to use it. Or in fact, because the cards, the locations are resolved at the whole end of the sequence, you know, you place out all your workers, everybody's finished all of their worker placement, now we resolve the locations, you may not get an opportunity to use that special ability you've just gained at all. So essentially that location becomes useless in the final round of the game. So we realised that we needed to add something else into those cards, which would still be valuable at the end, and in fact even more valuable, and that is endgame scoring conditions. So each of those specialists, those experts, those heroes, has an endgame scoring condition as well as their special ability. So they're still really valuable to get towards the end of the game. The next thing I think that I started to explore was it didn't seem enough to be going to the wilderness and having a choice of 3 dragons, or going to the market and buying a choice of 3 dragons. I wanted more dragons. And so I started to explore the idea of several layers in this wilderness. So you capture a dragon, and then you can, if you've still got surviving workers, then they can move up to the next rung in the wilderness and try and capture another dragon. And if you still have workers, you can move up again. So that shifted things quite a lot. The next shift, I think, was when we started pitching this game. So we started pitching this game around to publishers, maybe back as far as 2016, 2017, something like that. I showed it to a few publishers, and the feedback was always the same. They liked the game, they liked a lot of the mechanisms in it. I actually remember sitting down and playing it at one point with Vlada Shvatel, and the rest of his team at CGE were quite critical of the game, but Vlada Shvatel was very, very polite. But the criticism was all that the game mechanisms were great, but the rolling dice, it was too much luck, right? And that strategy players don't want that. And actually, Rob and I were starting to see this in our playtests, that, you know, the majority of the time, everyone would have a great time and really enjoy it. But every now and then, maybe 1 in 5 of our playtests, there'd be a player sat at the table who would have a miserable experience because every time they rolled the dice, they're getting 1s, somebody else is getting 6s all the way. Didn't matter how much mitigation we threw at them, how many re-roll tokens and things we threw at them, they were just unlucky and they had a bad experience playing the game. Well, 1 in 5 playtests, that's not great, is it? Because once you make that thousands of people playing this game, you know, you've got hundreds of people having a miserable experience. It wasn't going to fly. So we were a bit stuck at this point, and I started to think about what would happen if we removed all the randomness from the game. Apart from maybe the card draw at the start of each round where we lay out the cards, what happens if we don't use dice? Okay, which was kind of the defining feature of the game. What happens if we take that all out? But I still wanted to retain this idea that sometimes when you send out workers, they don't come back. Okay, because this is a dangerous thing, messing around with dragons, gathering up dragons and so on. So I started off by started using dice, but these dice had different types of workers on the different sides of them. So if you had an orange worker, a grunt, then that worker, yeah, they would perish, right? You send them out, they're only going to last 1 single use, okay? But maybe you could use those mitigation tokens to upgrade that grunt and turn it into a hunter who could go out into the wilderness to capture some dragons. Or you could turn it into a trader who could go out to the market, or into I can't remember what they were called, a handler who could go out to, you know, another location, gathering up the sets of dragons. I also introduced, or I think Rob and I introduced together, a new location which was a nest where you could go and you could get dragon eggs and things like this and form sets of dragon eggs. And so the handler was very good at that. So Rob and I were working very closely together on each of these things, but, you know, I would lead on some aspects of it, Rob would lead on other aspects of it. Rob was very, very good at coming up with special abilities and things like that for the heroes in the guild. I was reworking these locations and I was very specifically removing the dice and trying to find a way to make it work without dice. It soon became apparent that if I've got dice that I'm just flipping from one side to another, that's just an unwieldy component when really these could just be tokens. Okay, so if I've got grunts, let's have grunt tokens, and then I can swap them out for a merchant or a trader or whatever they were called at the time. Okay, and that takes away the need for these unwieldy custom dice, which are never getting rolled anyway. So that's where the tokens started to come in, and that's the reason that we had this system where you've got grunts who go out to locations and never come back. They're sort of the equivalent of the coins, the money that we had in the original prototypes, or the dice that were rolled and failed to hit their desired target. And then the specialists, which always come back, so they're essentially a guaranteed roll of a 6 on the dice, okay? So, but they can only go to certain locations. So in Emberheart, if you're sending out a warden, you're sending them out into the wilderness, up the mountain, to bring these dragons home, to rescue them from the poachers. But if you're sending out rangers, then they can go out to the poachers camp, and which replaces the old market, you know, because now we're going and we're rescuing these dragons that have been captured by these poachers. Or scouts, these are the ones that can go and find new workers to come and join your party, or they can go and speak to the heroes and get the heroes with the special abilities to come and join you. So it's all a token-based system now. And that pretty much gets us to where we are. Of course, there was loads of playtests, loads of development from there on. Okay, essentially Rob and I would work together from there, doing the playtests, tweaking things. We're looking at the duration of the game, we're looking at the player count, we're shifting and adapting. How many cards do we have? How much variability between those cards? Which abilities among the heroes are overpowered, and so on. And we got it to a point where we were really happy and comfortable with it. It was a really nice worker placement game with this really unique bidding system. I hesitate to say unique. Probably somebody's used it, but I can't think of a game off the top of my head that uses it in exactly this form. And Yeah, it functioned really well and I felt really good about it. I felt like this was a game that I could kind of get in front of people. But then we hit the pandemic, of course, 2020. I wasn't going to Essenspiel. I wasn't getting to game design meetups as frequently. And for a good couple of years, this game kind of sat on the shelf, pretty much untouched, apart from with the occasional online playtests that we would do through Tabletop Simulator and things like that. Eventually, 2023, I got to Essenspiel and I took the prototype with me and I thought this is going to be my big push for this game. And I showed it to a lot of publishers and thankfully it went really well. You know, I got a lot of really, really positive feedback. I had a couple of offers of publication. I had other publishers who offered to work on the game, develop it with me and these sorts of things. It was really, really promising. But most excitingly, of course, Mindclash came forward with their offer and that was just a dream, you know, a dream company to work with. You know, with they've got such a great following and they make, albeit their games are much, much heavier than our game, they make these beautiful games which are really, really well regarded, probably heavier than the sort of games that I would usually play, but I was aware of the sort of caliber of this of this group, you know. So yeah, it was a wonderful offer. It was great to get the opportunity to work with them. We had no idea that they were going to bring Andrew Bosley on board or anything like that. We had no idea of the scale of sort of investment they were going to put into the game in terms of making it just beautiful in terms of the production, but also the marketing they've done, which has been fantastic. So it's been a great journey. I did say to Mindclash at a fairly early stage that, you know, my life was getting pretty difficult. My personal life, there's a lot going on, right? And the same with Rob, right? He's got a lot going on. So I did say to Mindclash, I wasn't going to be able to do a huge amount of development on the game. I wasn't going to have time. And this is an important conversation to have as a designer, right? When you're signing these contracts, you need to lay out the terms with the publishers about what you're willing to do, because some publishers will expect you to do development work after signing the game. And it's not really spelled out how much and whether are you going to be paid for that work? This could be hours and hours, months of work, altering the game to their specifications. So I was quite clear with Mindclash from the outset that really I didn't have the scope to do that. And so they were going to have to take the product kind of as it is, and I was going to have to trust them to do development work on it, which I was willing to do, frankly. And the development work that they did was great. They wanted to add a bit of complexity to the game, which I was totally on board with, because although this was going into their more accessible line, their fans, their players like really, really complex games. So even an accessible game for them has to have a degree of complexity to it. And so that's where the individual player boards were introduced, and this idea of the preserves and matching up the dragons with the matching coloured preserves in order to increase yourself on your own personal player board. So these little sort of almost tech trees to increase your individual powers, and having that dragon token that can go out once around. You know, that all comes from the development team in Mindclash. The day that we had the email saying that Andrew Bosley was doing the artwork, we had that came with the front cover, was there with the name Emberheart, you know, all presented to myself and Rob. That was an exciting day, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, with the kind of proviso that we couldn't tell anybody about it. So, you know, we had this hugely exciting news that we had to keep to ourselves, but at least Rob and I could speak to each other about it. So I'm delighted that the game's getting out there. Mindclash have sent me a copy of the game. I haven't had all my designer copies yet, but I've got one copy, so I've been able to play it a number of times now, and it's great. It just plays well. It plays better than ever, right? It plays better than all of our different prototypes. They really have done what developers are supposed to do, which is improve the game, make it slicker, just make it shine. So it's a wonderful product. It's available now. It'll be available at Essenspiel in the next 2 weeks. The pre-order period has closed at the end of last month, but I believe pre-orders are starting to get into people's hands. I'm starting to see comments and discussion online. And so hopefully a little bit of buzz is picking up again. When that pre-order opened a few weeks ago, we were at #1 on the Board Game Geek hotness for a few days. That was extremely exciting. And hopefully now it'll be in local game stores very soon, I would imagine. If the pre-orders are getting out there, once Essensspiel is over, then, you know, it should start to get out into people's hands all around the world. I believe there are multiple different international versions of the game that are international partners that are partnering with Mindclash to produce the game. So, I mean, who knows what happens next? I guess we wait and see how it's received. Do people like it? Do people buy it? And then, I guess, conversations with Mindclash about what do we do? What do we do from here? But even if nothing more happens, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to have created. I'm delighted to have made it. It's been a wonderful partnership with Mindclash. And yeah, this feels like a highlight in my game design career so far. Yeah. Let's see what happens next. Thanks very much for watching. Please also check out my other 2 games that are launching at Essensspiel. One is Flip Pick Towers, which is available to demo with Osprey Games. This is a flip and write game, which is going to be released in March 2026. Another lovely game and a collaboration with Rob Fisher again. And the other game is Suricata, which is a 2-player abstract strategy game, a wooden handcrafted game by Gerhard Spielendesign, which is available again at Essensspiel to purchase, but you can also buy that online on Gerhard Spielendesign's website or through Philibert if you're in France, and they do ship internationally, although obviously that comes at a bit of a cost. If you'd like to know more about the design decisions that went into Suricata, watch this video next.